Hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, an enchanted rose. Now before I get into this week's show, I just want to show you guys something. I got a package in the mail the other day from one of my regular viewers, and what they sent along was this. So, this is awesome. Guys, I just want to say thank you. You know who you are. I don't need to mention names, but I didn't want any more time to go by without giving an official, hey, thanks very much on the show to you guys. So thank you very much. I love it. So now we're going to get on with the show now, and what we need to do to start this project is we need to use some modeling clay. Well, I have some of this oven-baked clay. I have some red and a green, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to sculpt a rose, and I'll show you guys how to do that. Hopefully it'll work out, but for starters, we'll get rid of the green because we're not quite ready for that yet. We're going to start off with some red. So break yourself off a small little piece, and we'll start with that. Well, the honest truth in all of this is I've never really worked with this stuff before, so this will be an experiment. And I have about a 1/2 inch cubed piece of the red here. I'm going to partially flatten it with my fingers, and then I've made this little rolling pin. Isn't that adorable? Look at that. So I made this little rolling pin out of some ABS plastic, and I'm just going to roll this out until it's nice and thin, because this will be the petals of our rose. So I have it here on this cutting mat, and we'll just roll this out thin, and then we'll move on to the next step. I have the clay rolled out till it's about 1/16 of an inch thick. We're actually going to go a little thinner than that, but I have a little storage tube. It's a 1/2 inch diameter, and I'm just going to use it to punch out some 1/2 inch discs or pieces of this clay. So these will represent the petals. Now there's more to do to them, but for now we're just going to punch out a bunch of them, and then when we get that done we can move on to the next step. Okay, so you guys get the idea there on what we're looking for. So what I need to do is we need to roll these out even thinner. But before we do that, we're going to take one edge of it and just dent it in a little bit so that it's almost like a weird kind of a heart shape. Just like that. Hopefully you can see that. And then once you get that in place, then we're going to roll it out even thinner than what we had it before. Now you got to remember, this is supposed to mimic a natural thing, which is a rose. So not every petal is perfect. Not every petal is exactly aligned. These may even be a little bigger than what I really want them to be, but as I said, it's an experiment. Now you can see, or maybe you can't, these are super thin at this point in time. And we'll just get that up off the cutting board, and this will be our initial or first petal. And what you want to do with it once you get it off the board, it's giving me a hard time here. Once you get it off the board cleanly, you want to roll it. Now I'm not too happy with this one. This one got torn up as I was trying to remove it. So I'm going to roll another one here. At least the clay is reusable. I'm going to roll another one, and then I'll show you how to form that first petal. Alright, so this first petal here is going to get rolled into a tight little cylinder. So we're just going to start it here, and then we'll start rolling. just like that. There we go. And then once you get that, we're going to roll it out so that it's tapered, because that will help to give our shape of the rose. So there you go. That's what you're going to end up with. You've got a little tiny cone, and inside you can see that it's kind of rolled up there. So now your next step that you want to do is just like you did with that one, roll out another petal. And once you get it rolled out, we can wrap it around the core of our rose assembly. Now this petal here is a little too perfect for my liking, so it's no big deal. I'm just going to take an X-Acto knife and I'm going to cut it so that it is now more of a rose petal shape. See that there? And then once I get that done, I'll roll it out a little more to even up my edges. And using a straight blade, I'll just carefully remove it from our cutting mat, just like that. There we go. And now we'll roll it around our initial assembly. Now you don't want to roll it tight at the top. You want spaces there at the top end of your rose so that you have gaps, so that it looks more like a flower. You don't want it to be perfectly uniform here. All right, there's another petal of the rose. And again, we will roll it just between our fingers like what I'm doing here to get that cone shape. Just like that. And this is going to end up getting longer. We're going to cut it off later. All right, let's move on to the next petal. And again, roll it out thin. Now this process is just going to continue. You will carry on making these thin little petals, wrapping them around your assembly until you get the shape of a flower that you like. There we go. And again, we'll wrap it around our project. Now, once you start getting a little further out with the petals, you're going to want to basically curl over each one of them so that they're curling out to the outside. You don't have to do it in the initial core petals, but you will need to do that as your rose gets bigger and fuller. It just gives a better sense of realism, to be honest. So don't forget, curl those petals as you go. All right, and with that, I'm going to say that my rose is done. I don't think I want any more than that. So I'm just going to mold the bottom, and we're going to cut this off until it's the shape that we want. We're going to make a couple of extra rose petals for this one because it'll add to the whole enchanted rose thing. I'll show you more about that later. So just make a couple extra red petals for your rose. Now with your extra petals made and your rows ready to go, we're just going to clean up all of the excess clay here on our cutting mat, and we're going to open up and move on to our green clay. Now with our green clay, I have cut off again about a 1/2 inch by a 1/2 inch piece, and we need to make a couple of things, one being the stem and the other being a few leaves. So the leaves are no big deal. We're just going to roll out the green clay on nice and thin and use a knife to cut out some leaf shapes. Our stem, again, is really no big deal either, as it is just going to be, basically you want to roll this out into like a little snake kind of thing. So we'll roll out our stem. You got to remember the proportions here of this rose. It's a very tiny rose. So to have a big thick stem like this just wouldn't look right. So just make sure that you're rolling it out thin enough to be proportionate to your model. Now at the end of our stem here, I'm going to make kind of a cone shape, because I want to mount our rose into this eventually. But you don't want it to be too bulky. You want it to be proportionate to your flower. So we're just going to give it a little bit of a platform there to be able to be glued onto. This clay is a little stickier than I thought it was going to be. Again, like I said, I've never worked with it. And then our rose, as you can see here, is going to glue onto there. I don't know how well you can see that. It's still a little bulky for my liking, so I'm going to trim it down and fix it all up. And then when I get this stem done, I'll come back and see you. And there we have our stem. It's a little long, but we can cut it off after, before we actually bake it. So now it's just a matter of cutting our leaves, and for that we're just going to cut them with an X-Acto knife. We're going to leave a little bit extra here that we can attach them to the stem, just like that, and then we'll cut one more. They might be a little thick for this rose, but that's what our little cute roller is for. So let's peel this off here, see how we make out. There we go, there's our two little leaves. And yeah, I would say they're just a little too thick for my liking. So we'll just give them a little rolling just to make them a little bit thinner. If we need to trim them down, we will. This one here is a little big for me. So there we go. We'll just slice it like that. And then we can attach them to our stem. One there. And then one just below it on the opposite side. We don't want a lot here, just a couple, just to give it that much more realism. There we go. Just like that. And then we'll cut it off to length. I'm going to say it's going to be about, chop, right there. Perfect. All right, let's clean up this clay and we can move on. Well, now it's time to bake our clay. So I'm going to take it in the house. I'm going to put it in the toaster oven at 275 degrees Fahrenheit, and you want to time it for 15 minutes for every 1/4 inch of thickness. This one here is a lot thinner than a 1/4 inch. The rose itself is a little more than a 1/4 inch thick. So I'm just going to be very careful and check it periodically to make sure that everything is cooking correctly and I'm not overcooking it. because you don't want to do that. It ruins the clay. I will also point out that you want to be careful with this clay only because the dyes that are in it can stain unprotected surfaces. So if you're working on a piece of wood, or you're on your bench, or your desk in your office at home or whatever, this stuff can stain it. So a little bit of wax paper maybe, or parchment paper, something laid down to protect it. For me, it was a cutting mat, which wipes up really easily. So anyway, let's get this baked up, and I'll come back and see you when it's all baked and then cooled. Well, the whole baking process is done and the clay is hardened. If you've never worked with this stuff before, when you take it out of the oven, it will still be somewhat pliable. It's not going to be hard, but as it cools, it will harden. Now, the petals and the stem itself, I ended up putting that in the oven for about 10 minutes. And the rose, because it's a larger chunk by the time you roll everything together, that one actually ended up getting cooked for 20 minutes. So now we can glue the parts of our rose together, basically the bud of our rose, onto our stem, and then we can carry on from there. Well, it's now time to make the mold in order to pour our resin in. And I just have this old piece of 2-inch clear plastic tubing. I just found it lying around the shop. You don't have to use clear, but I will tell you that I chose the clear on purpose because it's going to allow me to see whether or not my rose is going to be centered in here once I get it in place. So the very first thing that we want to do here is we're going to need to use our hot glue gun, and we're going to run a good bead of hot glue all around the base of our clear tube just to get a good seal so that our epoxy resin does not run out of our mold. Well, the first thing that we want to do is our spare petals that we made, we want to drop them down into our mold. Now these will be petals that have fallen off the Enchanted rose, so they don't have to be perfectly in line and that sort of thing, but you want to try to keep them away from the edges, because when we turn this on the lathe, you don't want to get them too close. Now I'm not sure if this stuff floats, so I have a little dowel here to push them down into the resin should we run into that sort of a problem. So we will just place our hardener in, just like this. And then we will mix up this resin once we get the actual epoxy itself in there. We're going to mix it up, and we want to pour about 1 inch, thereabouts, of resin into our mold, and then we're going to get it into our pressure pot, put it under 50 pounds of pressure, and let it completely cure. Well, I don't think the petals float, but the force of the resin going in there has forced them out to the edges. So we are going to use our little dowel here, position them where we want, and then we're going to get this into the pressure pot. Well, there's absolutely nothing to do now other than to wait. So we're going to let this sit overnight, and I'll come back to it tomorrow when this is all dried up. So I'll see you then. Well, here it is the next day, and we will just check on our casting, and it looks good. It looks good. It looks nice and clear. We have about 1 inch of resin down in the bottom, and our rose petals, hopefully you can see that, our rose petals are sitting nicely at the base of our resin pour. So the next thing that we need to do now is glue our rose into this mold. And we're going to use a little tiny drop of CA glue, hold it in place till it cures. We're going to glue it centered in our mold. Well, now that we have our rows glued in place, we just need to fill the rest of our mold up with clear resin right to the top. And we'll just mix up another batch of resin here and pour it in over our rows. Now I have some concerns about pouring this in, as the rose has some pretty small cavities in around the petals, and I really want that resin to get into those areas. So you want to make sure when you get to that point that you pour slowly and let the resin really sink in there. And now, once again, like we were before with the first resin pour, we are in a holding pattern. And that actually works out rather well because we are out of time for this week. I certainly didn't expect the explanation of making the clay rose to take as long as it did, but again, like my other shows, I'd rather give you that extra information and make it so that you can produce a good product rather than trying to guess and fumble your way through it. Guys, I hope that you've enjoyed it up until now. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the bell so that you don't miss the notifications of future episodes of my show. Guys, I hope you're going to try this for yourself. And I hope you're going to join me for part 2 next week when I bring you yet another Alternative Tuesdays.